The candlelight flickers against the crimson drapes, their heavy folds swallowing sound in the royal nursery of El Escorial. Outside, the autumn wind rattles the latticed windows of the Spanish court, whispering across the stone corridors like ghosts searching for doors left ajar. The palace breathes slowly in the dimness, every breath steeped in incense and fear. In the center of the room rests a gilded cradle carved with saints, rimmed in velvet and silent. Inside that cradle lies a baby, swaddled in the softest linens Spain can provide, a child born with the full weight of empire on his chest, a child who cannot hold up his own head. His name is Carlos, Charles to the world. He is the only surviving son of King Philip IV of Spain and Queen Mariana of Austria, the last Habsburg heir of Spain, and he is broken. Let me tell you a story, one that begins not with war or betrayal but with a baby born in 1661, under the echoing ceilings of a crumbling empire. He does not cry like other newborns. His nurses are worried, though they don't say it aloud. His mother weeps more often than she smiles. His physicians whisper behind the thick tapestries, behind the coats of arms, behind the holy Roman dignity stitched into the walls, because they know, they all know, something has gone terribly wrong. The baby's mouth won't close. His tongue spills over his lip like an unruly servant. His chin is absent, his jaw stretched and sagging like softened wax. His limbs don't move with strength or intent. He sleeps almost constantly, and when he wakes, he is listless. He does not suckle, he does not smile. One nurse murmurs to another that his eyes look not vacant, but ancient, not like a child, but something left too long in darkness. They do not call him a monster, not yet, but they will. This is not just the story of one child. It is the story of a dynasty brought low not by sword or siege, but by its own blood. A family so obsessed with keeping power within that they folded in upon themselves, generation after generation, until what they created was not a king, but a mirror of their mistakes. The Habsburgs ruled half of Europe. They wore crowns that stretched from the Americas to Austria, from Milan to Madrid. They were emperors, princes, queens, and popes, and they feared nothing more than outsiders, so they married one another, over and over, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, aunt to nephew. It was God's will, they told themselves, divine order, not deformity, but God does not shield those who play recklessly with life. You see, the Habsburgs weren't just keeping their bloodline pure, they were sealing it shut. Every generation, they trimmed the family tree until it barely branched. The roots tangled with themselves. And then, Charles. When you picture royalty, you may imagine trumpets and courtyards. You may see gold and ermine, silk gloves and swords hung ceremoniously. But I want you to imagine something else. A baby who cannot chew, a child who chokes on bread, a boy with teeth too large for a mouth that cannot close, who drools in court, whose words come out wet and slurred, like prayers caught on a broken bell. This boy is a king. By the time Charles is 3, his governess records that he cannot walk. At 5, he can barely stand. His body is weak. His mind, no one dares assess it too closely, not officially. But foreign ambassadors write back to their courts with phrases like, "The prince is not well formed," or "He seems incapable of understanding." His own family refers to him not as a ruler, in training, but as El Hechizado, the bewitched. And, in a way, he is, because Charles's body is a record, a living document of genetic collapse. The Habsburg jaw, that great protruding symbol of family pride, has become a deformity. His tongue is too large, his lower jaw too long, he cannot close his mouth, he cannot chew, he cannot speak clearly, and worse still, his bones are fragile. His skull doesn't fully fuse, his immune system is as soft as his muscles. He suffers from chronic infections, epilepsy, and gastrointestinal illness. Each year he survives is seen as a miracle or a curse. Behind closed doors, the court begins to fracture. His mother, Queen Mariana, clings to the church and to silence. She insists her son is chosen by God, that his suffering is divine, that his purity, his royal blood, is proof of heavenly favor, not failure. But the whispers grow louder. Some say the child is cursed. Others say he is the punishment for sins hidden beneath velvet robes. At court, Charles is dressed in miniature armor, in golden robes, in stiff silk ruffs. They prop him up for portraits like a puppet king. Artists paint him flatteringly smoothing the sagging jaw, brightening the dullness of his eyes. They paint him not as he is, but as he ought to be. And so, history begins to lie for him. But the lies cannot hold, because Spain is watching, and Spain is dying. In the latter half of the 17th century, the Spanish Empire is a shadow of its former self. Its colonies drain its coffers. Its people starve, while silver ships sink into debt. The once mighty Habsburg Empire is ruled by a boy who cannot command his own body. Ministers argue in council, factions form around the Queen, and the clergy surround Charles like bees around spoiled honey, each promising healing, each demanding obedience. By the time Charles turns 6, the kingdom is in quiet crisis. His father is long dead, his mother governs in his name, and the people begin to wonder, can this boy ever truly rule? Can this heir produce heirs of his own? Or is this the end? The boy does not understand the whispers. He cannot read them. He can barely speak them. But he feels them. He watches eyes flicker toward him with fear, with pity, with cold calculation. He knows what it means when the room grows quiet, when the priest tightens his grip, when the physician sighs too deeply before speaking. He knows, even if he cannot say it. In the stillness of the nursery, we return once more, to the cradle, to the silence. Charles sleeps beneath the cross of empire, beneath banners that grow heavier with each breath. His chest rises, barely. The wind sighs across the towers. Spain waits. This is where the story begins, not with greatness but with grief, not with ascension but with inheritance. A broken child, born to a throne built on centuries of broken choices. And from here, the horror only deepens. Come closer now, not too fast. Let the breath settle. Let your mind loosen its grip. Let the flicker of candlelight soften your focus. And follow me not through corridors of stone this time, but through corridors of ancestry. Down bloodlines mapped like a spider's web, but twisted, folded, coiled in on themselves until the center collapses. This is not a family tree. This is a knot, a golden, rotting knot, and it begins long before Charles ever drew breath. Let me tell you about the Habsburgs. You've seen their faces in paintings, arched brows, heavy lids, lips pressed in royal seriousness. But look closer. There's a pattern hiding in the brushstrokes. That jaw, you'll see it, over and over, the lower lip pushed forward, the chin receding, as if the face has forgotten how to close. That, my friend, is the infamous Habsburg jaw, a symbol of royal heritage and genetic implosion. To understand Charles, we must rewind centuries, to the beginning of the Habsburg obsession, not with land, not with war, but with themselves. This powerful dynasty began as regional counts in the Swiss Alps. Yes, humble roots, but rose, by political marriage and battlefield ambition, to become emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. Their strategy, not conquest, but consolidation. They married their cousins, then their nieces, then their sisters. The logic was simple: keep power in the family. The result, however, was far from simple. One of the most damning statistics lies buried in the family records. In the generations leading to Charles II of Spain, over 80% of marriages were between close blood relatives. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and sometimes, as we'll see, brothers marrying sisters. Imagine that for a moment. A single family line, attempting to reproduce itself like a circle folding tighter each time. No fresh blood, no outside influence, only repetition. Like trying to photocopy a 1,000 times over. The image becomes distorted, blurred, then monstrous. Charles was not the first to suffer. He was merely the end result. Let me tell you about Joanna of Castile, Charles's great-great-grandmother. History calls her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. She wandered court halls whispering to herself, clutching her dead husband's coffin, convinced he was only sleeping. Her madness was blamed on grief. But what if it was already in the blood? Then came Philip II of Spain, Charles's grandfather, whose marriages crisscrossed the family map like a closed maze. One of his wives was his own niece. His children? Sickly, slow, plagued by early death. One of them, Don Carlos, was locked in his chambers for fear he might murder someone. He beat his servants, threatened his father, starved himself for attention. When he died, Spain mourned more with relief than grief. And still, the Habsburgs persisted. Now, close your eyes. Picture a ledger, centuries old, worn and water-stained. On each page, names written in elegant Latin script. Ferdinand, Maria, Philip, Anne, Charles. Then again, Ferdinand, Maria, Philip, Anne, Charles. Over and over. The same names, the same unions, the same bloodlines traced in loops, until the ink begins to bleed. By the time we reach Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, Charles's parents, we are at the edge of that ledger. The ink has begun to run dry. Philip was Mariana's uncle. Let that settle in. She was just 14 when she married him. She had been promised to his son, her cousin, but when he died, she was handed to his father instead. A girl bride, draped in heavy silk, sent from Austria to Spain to breed a future that biology had already turned against her. Together, Philip and Mariana tried to produce heirs, but the children came sickly, malformed, or stillborn. One died within hours. Another lasted barely a week. One daughter survived for a time but was so deformed she was hidden from public view. Finally, after years of pregnancies and funerals, Charles was born. Alive, but barely. Historians have since calculated that Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of over 0.25. What does that mean? That genetically, his parents were closer than siblings. His DNA had less diversity than the offspring of a brother and sister. It's staggering, and it's fatal. Now, you may be asking, why did they keep doing this? Why did the Habsburgs marry each other, despite the consequences growing clearer with every birth? The answer lies in fear. Fear of dilution, fear of rivals. Fear that if even a drop of foreign blood entered the line, their divine right to rule might be questioned. So they folded in over and over, like a dying star collapsing into itself. They didn't just preserve power, they embalmed it. This was the theology of royalty. God placed you on the throne. Your bloodline was proof of that. And if your child came out broken, that was a test. Or worse, a punishment. In the palace halls of Madrid, the priests whispered prayers over malformed cradles. Doctors bled infants to balance the humors, and midwives swaddled tiny bodies in silence, hoping each gasp wasn't the last. No one spoke aloud the word that everyone feared, the word that echoed beneath every royal birth. Curse. But was it a curse? Or just a choice, repeated too many times? Charles was not cursed by witches. He was not damned by rebels. He was built generation by generation by a family unwilling to look beyond itself. A mirror turned inward until all it reflected was disease, sorrow, and slow decay. And yet, he was still a king. He was baptized with holy oils, dressed in regal garments, painted to appear as if nothing were wrong. The court proclaimed his survival a miracle, but miracles do not drool, they do not twitch. They do not speak in half-formed syllables or lose control of their bowels in front of foreign dignitaries. Charles was a symbol, not of strength, but of warning. The Spanish court spun around him like a rusted clock. Ministers jostled for control. Foreign powers watched hungrily, knowing he would never produce an heir. And yet, through all of this, the Habsburgs still refused to see the truth. They clutched their titles like relics, blind to the rot beneath the velvet. So, here we are, at the turning point. A boy king, too sick to speak, a court, too stubborn to change, a dynasty, too proud to stop itself from dying. The bloodline had folded in, and now it would begin to break. Charles was born into a palace carved from marble and myth, but his body refused to carry the weight of that legacy. From the moment he emerged, something was wrong. The midwives knew it, though they dared not speak. The nurses exchanged glances, uneasy. His mother, Mariana of Austria, only saw what she wished to see: an heir, a prince, a vessel to preserve the fading Spanish crown. But the truth was written plainly on the child's face. His jaw was too small, almost absent. His tongue, grotesquely large, filled the cavern of his mouth and spilled over his lips. He could not latch properly when fed. He choked often, gasping, flailing, unable to draw breath or even cry with strength. They tried one nurse after another, hoping for a miracle in milk. But it was not nurture that failed, it was nature. Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg monarch, was not born sick in the conventional sense. His malady was deeper. It lived in his genes, centuries of inbreeding, compressed into a single fragile form. His body was not merely weak, it was confused. Muscles refused to respond, limbs moved with delay, and his development lagged far behind that of other infants. He could not sit upright without assistance, even at an age when other royal children were being dressed for court appearances. When he tried to speak, his tongue refused cooperation. What emerged were sounds, but rarely words, no matter how hard his tutors coaxed him. By the time he was 4, it was clear Charles would never be a healthy boy. His legs trembled when he stood. He drooled constantly, unable to close his mouth. His teeth grew crooked, mismatched, many of them rotting before they fully emerged. And all the while doctors offered hopeful lies. They told his mother he was merely slow, that boys of noble blood sometimes took longer to mature, that he would strengthen with age. But he didn't. He only grew taller and stranger. His skull was elongated, a Habsburg trait exaggerated to a grotesque degree. His forehead was wide and heavy. His chin, the infamous chin, was practically non-existent. When viewed in profile, his face sloped sharply backward, as though pulled into itself. His lower jaw didn't align with the upper. It was so misaligned, in fact, that he could barely chew his food. Servants were forced to mash his meals into pastes. Even in adulthood, he relied on soft diets, soups, soaked bread, and pulps, because his mouth could not process anything harder. Behind the palace walls, rumors grew, not just about his physical appearance, but about his mind. He was said to be simple, though his intelligence was not easy to define. Some days he could carry on a conversation halting, yes, but alert. Other days he seemed absent, his eyes glassy, his words incoherent. Those closest to him knew he struggled to distinguish reality from ceremony. He had been raised in an environment of constant manipulation. Priests, nobles, courtiers, all of them shaping him, shielding him, directing him. But the mind of the king resisted structure. It wandered, and as his body continued to fail him, his mind retreated further into superstition, faith, and fear. Charles was watched constantly, not just for protection, but for signs of collapse. His health was so fragile that a cold could spiral into near death. When he was 7, he nearly died from what began as a fever. His lungs filled with fluid, he coughed blood. Priests were summoned to administer last rites, and yet he survived. Again and again he survived, though no one understood how. It was as if he hovered in a state between life and death, not strong enough to live fully, yet too royal to be allowed to die. His education was largely ceremonial. Tutors taught him to recite prayers and memorize royal lineages, but he never learned to read fluently. Writing was painful, his fingers too weak, his coordination too poor, and yet he was paraded through court functions like any other king. Dressed in stiff velvet robes and crowned with the weight of centuries, he was placed on thrones and wheeled through processions, barely able to lift a hand in greeting. His court claimed he was sovereign by divine right, but his body betrayed him at every turn. The most tragic truth of Charles's condition was not merely that he was unwell, it was that he had been made this way. Every twitch of his muscle, every misfiring nerve, every malformed bone was a signature of genetic collapse. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were double first cousins. The Habsburg dynasty had folded in upon itself so many times that their bloodlines had lost coherence. And Charles was the final proof of that collapse. A boy not of sin, but of stubborn tradition. A child molded by power's refusal to evolve. As he aged, his body continued to resist function. Puberty arrived late, if at all. His voice remained high and childlike. His limbs lengthened, but lacked strength. Even his sleep was troubled. He suffered from seizures, night terrors, and long stretches of insomnia. And yet, the court kept up the facade. Portraits of Charles showed a robust young monarch with bright eyes and regal posture. But these were fantasies painted on top of decline. In truth, his face sagged. His expression was often vacant. And when he spoke, those in the room leaned in with discomfort, partly out of duty, partly to decipher his slurred, half-formed thoughts. Behind the palace doors, servants whispered that the king could not walk without assistance, that he soiled himself well into adulthood, that his muscles twitched involuntarily. These were not the rumors of political enemies. They were the testimonies of those who dressed him, who fed him, who tucked him into bed each night. They saw the truth, a monarch held upright by ceremony and desperation. Spain, by this point, was a ghost of its former glory. The empire stretched thin, its gold depleted, its armies scattered. The people needed a symbol, someone to believe in, even if that belief required denial. And so Charles remained king, because there was no one else to wear the crown. No heir, no strength left in the royal blood to produce one. His body continued to betray him with every passing year. His legs twisted inward, his back hunched, his eyes sank deeper into their sockets. Medical journals from the time list over a dozen separate conditions diagnosed by physicians from across Europe: hydrocephalus, rickets, mandibular prognathism, epilepsy, and more. But none of these labels truly captured what Charles suffered from. His disease had no name. It was not singular. It was structural, genetic, dynastic. By the time he reached his 20s, Charles could barely stand for long periods. His hands shook violently. His mouth leaked saliva. He often sat in silence, blinking slowly, surrounded by advisors who ruled in his name. He was a monarch in title, only a puppet moved by the fingers of others. Yet still he lived. Still he breathed. The child who could not cry, who could not chew, who could not walk without help, had grown into a king who watched his empire crumble, powerless to halt its decline. In another world, he might have lived as a quiet boy, cared for in a monastery or a private estate. But Charles was not allowed that mercy. He was born into kingship. And so, every failure of his body became a failure of a nation. Every stumble was a political omen. Every seizure was a divine punishment. And every sigh from his failing lungs was heard as a whisper from history itself. This is what happens when blood forgets how to breathe. And yet he endured. He endured because his death meant chaos. He endured because centuries of royal pride could not accept defeat. He endured not because his body obeyed, but because Spain had no other choice. The palace was full of mirrors, but Charles rarely looked into them, not because he was vain, he was not, but because even he knew that the face looking back was not meant for a king. The great halls of El Escorial, the summer salons of Aranjuez, the corridors of the Alcazar in Madrid, they all gleamed with polished glass and golden frames. But Charles passed them with eyes turned downward, or with a blank, cloudy stare. He had long learned what others saw when they looked at him, so he tried not to see it himself. Portraits, however, told a different story. In oil and canvas, Charles was transformed. He became what the Habsburgs needed him to be, a monarch of solemn dignity, a figurehead of divine right, a descendant of emperors. Painters were instructed to soften the worst features, to shift the light so the shadows concealed the droop of his jaw, the asymmetry of his eyes, the slackness of his expression. The portraits stretched reality like the bloodlines that created him, always reaching for a beauty that no longer existed. To the world beyond the palace walls, these portraits were truth. Diplomats from Vienna, Venice, and Paris were sent likenesses of Charles in formal attire, his lips tightly shut to conceal his malformed mouth, his body posed to appear stronger than it was. One hand might rest confidently on a sword, another would clutch a scroll or a scepter, but the reality was that Charles could barely lift a blade, and he had never once written a decree by hand. His signature, when needed, was a slow, shaky scrawl, sometimes traced by a servant guiding his hand. These masks painted, embroidered, served not only the court, but Charles himself. He had been raised in a world that demanded appearances, even when truth was unbearable. From a young age, he had learned to smile on cue, to sit motionless for long hours, to wear gowns of silver-threaded silk that weighed more than he did. The crown he wore for coronations was too heavy for his neck to support for long. After each public appearance, he would collapse into a chair, soaked with sweat, his muscles trembling. And yet, the illusion had to be maintained. Spain, they said, needed a king, not a patient. Behind closed doors, Charles was surrounded by caretakers more than any monarch before him. He had physicians who examined him daily, confessors who monitored his soul, and a rotating cast of nobles who performed the rituals of rule on his behalf. He rarely bathed himself. He was dressed like a doll. When he ate, his food was pre-chewed or mashed into liquid. Attendants wiped his chin between bites. One wrong texture could cause him to gag or choke. These details were never spoken of outside court. To admit them would be to unravel the carefully maintained mask of monarchy. His mother, Queen Mariana, was perhaps the most devoted to the illusion. She insisted he appear in processions. She had him blessed before the people, paraded through cathedrals, displayed during feast days. She clung to the belief that her son, her broken, fragile son, was chosen by God. If he suffered, then it was divine suffering. If he was malformed, then it was a trial meant to test the faith of a nation. But in private, even she sometimes wept, especially when he failed to speak clearly, or when he stared into space for hours, lost in his own fog. Charles himself did not always understand what he represented. His mind was not as dull as some claimed. He could recognize flattery. He could sense fear. He could even form opinions, though they often emerged slowly, like smoke from damp wood. But his grasp of politics, of diplomacy, of military affairs, these things were shallow, shaped entirely by those around him. When others spoke of alliances or wars, he would nod vaguely or repeat phrases he had been taught. He often asked for religious counsel instead, believing that only through prayer could his ailments be cured. And yet, despite all the masking, Charles began to suspect he was different. Children whispered when he passed. Some servants crossed themselves in his presence. There were moments rare but real when he asked his mother why he was not like other kings, why he had no strength, why his face looked the way it did, why the noble ladies avoided meeting his gaze for long. Mariana would hush him gently, assuring him he was God's chosen. But silence was not always comfort, and sometimes, when he found himself alone in a corridor, he would stop before a mirror and stare. It was not hatred he felt, nor even shame. It was confusion. He had been told since birth that he was royal, that he was strong, that he was the embodiment of empire. But the figure in the mirror looked nothing like a ruler. His eyes were watery and dull. His lips drooped open. His jaw receded so far back that his tongue pushed forward constantly. His skin was pale, waxy, almost translucent. He looked less like a monarch and more like a relic, a statue beginning to melt in the sun. The masks extended to his marriages. At age 18, Charles was wed to a French princess, Marie-Louise of Orléans. She was 16, pale, quiet, terrified. The marriage had been arranged to strengthen Spain's alliance with France. Marie-Louise had heard rumors of her husband's condition, but nothing could prepare her for the reality. On their wedding night, Charles was carried to her chamber by attendants. He smiled at her with lips he could barely close. He tried to speak, but his words slurred together. The consummation, if it happened at all, was brief and fumbling. There would be no heir. For years the court blamed Marie-Louise. They whispered that she was too cold, too proud, too uninterested in her husband. But in truth, she lived in misery. Charles doted on her like a child on a toy, clinging, needy, obsessive. He showered her with gifts but could not hold a conversation for more than a few minutes. She became isolated, depressed, and eventually ill. She died in her early 20s, her body worn thin by sadness, and perhaps poison, though no one dared say so aloud. Charles remarried, this time to a German princess, Maria Anna of Neuburg. She, too, arrived with hope and left with despair. Like her predecessor, she could bear no children. The court now faced a terrifying truth. The king could not reproduce. The Habsburg line was ending not with a bang, but with a whisper. All the masks, all the mirrors, all the illusions, none of them could change the fact that Charles's body had betrayed its purpose. He was not just a failed monarch, he was a failed legacy. Still, the court tried to maintain the mask. Foreign dignitaries were given limited access to him. Letters were censored, public appearances were carefully staged. But it was impossible to fully hide the truth. By his 30s, Charles was visibly deteriorating. His skin sagged, his eyes became cloudy. He often spoke nonsense, confusing his ministers with muttered prayers or bizarre requests. At times, he believed he was possessed. Exorcists were summoned to the palace multiple times. One reported that demons had spoken through Charles's mouth. Another claimed that his condition was the result of witchcraft. The irony was brutal. A king whose family had burned thousands for heresy and sorcery now begged the church to cast devils from his soul. He was not merely sick, he was haunted. Not by spirits, but by history itself. The sins of a dynasty lived inside him, and as the kingdom crumbled, as colonies slipped away and rivals gathered at Spain's borders, Charles remained in his bedchamber, surrounded by crosses and candles, muttering to saints who could not save him. In his final years, the masks began to fall. No painter could restore the ruin of his face. No tailor could disguise the withered frame beneath the robes. No advisor could pretend that he ruled. He barely spoke. He barely moved. He was kept alive by habit, by tradition, by a court, terrified of what would happen when he was gone. But the truth finally, painfully, was visible to all. There was no power left. Only the echo of what once was. The mirrors were still there, lining the palace walls. But now they reflected something honest. Not a king, not a god. Just a boy who had been born into a costume too heavy to wear, and a legacy too poisoned to bear. A child made by royal blood, and undone by it. To understand Charles II's broken body, one must return to the cradle that built him, not the literal crib into which he was placed as an infant, but the cradle of bloodlines that wrapped around his DNA like a tightening noose. His body had not failed him by chance. It had not fallen victim to illness, nor to the cruelty of a god. It had been carefully constructed accidentally, obsessively, over centuries, by a dynasty that believed royal blood was sacred and must never be diluted. The House of Habsburg was one of the most powerful royal families in European history. They ruled over Austria, Burgundy, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire, and by the 16th century vast swathes of the New World. But that empire had one invisible thread running through it, a ruthless obsession with preserving the bloodline. They didn't just marry within the nobility, they married within themselves, uncles to nieces, first cousins to first cousins, and more alarmingly, siblings to siblings. By the time Charles was born in 1661, the Habsburg gene pool had grown dangerously shallow. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a wreath, circular, closed, inescapable. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was the niece of her husband, Philip IV of Spain. Philip himself had married his own niece before that. Charles's grandmother was both his great-aunt and his grandmother, depending on which branch you followed. These tangled roots were not the result of love or accident, they were deliberate political choices. The Habsburgs believed that the divine right to rule must be kept pure, and so they turned inward, generation after generation. Modern geneticists have studied Charles's lineage and determined that his coefficient of inbreeding, a scientific measure of genetic similarity between parents, was equivalent to that of a child born from brother and sister. The result was inevitable. His body became a ledger of inherited deformities. The infamous Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, reached its zenith in Charles. His underbite was so severe that he could not close his mouth fully. His speech was garbled, his chewing impaired, his breathing at times obstructed. But it didn't stop at his face. His internal organs were malformed. His immune system was weak. His neurological function was impaired. He suffered frequent seizures. He displayed signs of hydrocephalus, excess fluid on the brain, which may have caused the swelling of his skull and the pressure that impaired his cognition. He had little energy, his body aged quickly. He experienced episodes of sudden collapse, fainting, and memory loss. And still, the court carried on, as though none of this had happened, as though the child before them was not a warning carved in flesh. The truth was that Charles was not an anomaly. He was a consequence, a living product of policies that had prioritized bloodline over biology. This was not just about family tradition, it was about power. Marrying within the family meant consolidating wealth, avoiding inheritance disputes, and keeping rival dynasties from gaining a foothold. Every marriage was a chess move, but the board had been shrinking for a long time, and by the time Charles was born, there were few pieces left to move. The Habsburgs had long used religion to justify their dynastic strategies. They claimed their lineage was ordained by God, that their divine blood gave them the right to rule not just over kingdoms but over souls. Priests blessed their incestuous unions. Bishops officiated marriages that would horrify modern sensibilities. The church, entangled with royal favor, said nothing, and the people, too far removed from the inner workings of court, rarely questioned the practice. If anything, they saw the royal family as distant icons separate from humanity, and therefore exempt from its rules. But blood remembers. It carries the weight of decisions made long before a child draws breath. And in Charles, that weight became unbearable. He was not just sick, he was inherited sickness. He was not just malformed, he was the manifestation of genetic consequence. His body bore the signatures of dozens of ancestors folded into themselves. And still, the court demanded he act like a king. Charles had siblings, but none survived infancy. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and child deaths were common in his line, often hidden behind curtains of silence and ceremony. He was the last, the only surviving male heir of a once mighty house, which made his condition not just tragic, but apocalyptic. Spain's future sat in a body that could not walk without help, a mind that often failed to focus, and a line that could produce no more children. As he grew older, the implications of this blood legacy became impossible to ignore. European powers began circling like vultures. France, Austria, England all eyed the Spanish throne, waiting for the inevitable. They knew that Charles would not last. They knew he could not produce an heir. And so, alliances were drafted, wills were debated, territories were promised before Charles had even died. The War of Spanish Succession was already forming in the shadows because of a boy who had been born in a cradle built by his ancestors' fear. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to see Charles as grotesque, a caricature of inbreeding, a walking cautionary tale. But that does a disservice to the tragedy of his life. Charles did not choose his parents. He did not choose his blood. He did not ask to be king. He was born into a position that demanded perfection, and given a body that could not hold itself upright. He was expected to rule, to command armies, to produce heirs. Instead, he fought to eat, to speak, to breathe. In many ways, he was a prisoner of his palace, of his name, of his biology. His court paraded him around as a symbol of strength, even as he withered. His advisors ruled in his name, while he sat silently beside them. Foreign ambassadors watched him with pity, or horror, or both. And through it all, Charles endured, not because he was strong, but because he had no choice. The Habsburg bloodline had built a throne so heavy that no man could carry it. And yet, Charles was asked to sit on it day after day, year after year. In his later years, Charles would speak often of ghosts. He claimed his family was cursed. He believed he was being punished not just for his sins, but for those of his ancestors. He surrounded himself with exorcists, mystics, and monks. He fasted. He confessed. He begged God for mercy. But he could not undo what had already been written into his bones. When he finally died, at the age of 38, his body was autopsied. The findings were horrifying. His heart was the size of a walnut. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were filled with black sludge. His testicles were described as atrophied and undeveloped. His head was abnormally large. His body, in death as in life, told a story no one wanted to hear. This was not just the end of a man, it was the end of a line, brought down not by war or famine or rebellion, but by the slow, quiet horror of too much royal blood. Charles II was laid to rest beneath marble and gold, a king in title, a child in truth. His tomb was inscribed with prayers, but no monument could hide the reality of what he represented. He was the last echo of a dynasty that had confused power with purity, and in doing so, they had built a cradle of blood only to watch it break under the weight of its own ambition. The face had become a warning sign long before it became a punchline. To the royal courts of Europe, the Habsburg jaw was once a symbol of lineage, a visible thread that marked descent from greatness. But as the centuries turned, that thread began to unravel. It was no longer a mark of distinction, it was a red flag. The Habsburg face became the mirror in which power saw its own decay. It began subtly. In early portraits from the 15th and 16th centuries, the trait was barely noticeable. A strong lower jaw, perhaps, or a slightly protruding chin. These were not flaws, they were seen as signs of strength, even masculinity. Artists painted them with pride. Monarchs posed to emphasize their profile, unconcerned by the angular features that set them apart. But as the generations narrowed, as cousins married cousins and uncles took nieces as wives, the trait deepened. It grew longer, more exaggerated. The jaw began to swell unnaturally. The lower lip thickened and drooped. The chin extended forward while the upper face receded, creating a profile that no longer looked fully human. This was not artistic license. It was not caricature. It was biology, laid bare by a dynasty that refused to dilute itself. The condition, known today as mandibular prognathism, occurs when the lower jaw extends significantly beyond the upper. In moderate cases, it can cause cosmetic concerns. In severe cases, it can impair speech, chewing, and breathing. The Habsburgs suffered the severe kind. By the time Charles II was born, the condition had passed beyond the realm of discomfort and into deformity. His jaw wasn't just pronounced, it was dysfunctional. His face had collapsed inward and downward. His tongue had no room. His lips did not close. His mouth remained open nearly all the time, often leaking saliva. He could not pronounce words clearly. He could not bite into food. And when he smiled, which was rare, the effect was disturbing rather than endearing. What made the Habsburg face so disturbing wasn't just its appearance, it was its predictability. Generation after generation, the same exaggerated features reappeared, stronger each time. It was as though the dynasty was being carved out of stone, with each marriage cutting deeper into the same flawed mold. European observers noticed it. Courtiers whispered about it. Foreign ambassadors took note in their letters. The Habsburgs, they said, were beginning to look less like rulers and more like relics, like museum specimens of what happened when power defied nature. The family, of course, denied any problem. To admit fault in the royal body was to admit weakness in the state. Instead, they doubled down on the image of divine right. The Habsburg face was not a deformity. They insisted it was a mark of God's chosen rulers. They dressed it in jewels, they framed it in ermine and gold, they sat it on thrones. But the eyes of Europe could see what was happening. Spain, once a fearsome empire, now looked to the world through a slack-jawed monarch who could not speak his own decrees. Historians would later analyze portraits across the generations, measuring skull angles and jaw projections, cataloguing the progression of the facial curse. One study found that 11 generations of Habsburg rulers showed increasing signs of mandibular prognathism, often coupled with maxillary deficiency, a receding upper jaw. In Charles II, both were fully present. He was not just the heir to an empire, he was the end result of a closed circuit, a biological feedback loop that had spun too long. But it wasn't just the jaw. The face told a broader story. The heavy brow, the hollow eyes, the asymmetrical ears, these too were inherited. These too worsened over time. Charles's face sagged unevenly. His eyes were often bloodshot, his gaze unfocused. Even when dressed in full regalia, surrounded by grandeur, his presence was spectral. He did not radiate power, he radiated decay. It's tempting to see Charles's face as the final act in a family tragedy, but in truth, he was only the most visible symptom of a deeper disease. The Habsburgs had created a system in which purity of blood was valued above all, above health, above fertility, even above sanity. They had ignored the signs for centuries. They had buried children, passed over daughters, married boys to their aunts, and called it strength. The face was not the curse. The curse was the blindness that allowed it to continue. Still, the face remained a constant symbol, etched into coins, carved into statues, painted onto canvases across Europe. The Habsburgs controlled the image, even as it turned grotesque. Painters were instructed to soften the features. Sculptors were told to idealize the likeness. But not every artist complied. Some court painters, perhaps out of subtle rebellion or realism, preserved the true shape of their subjects. In their works, the jaw juts out sharply, the lips are parted awkwardly, the weight of the deformity is visible, undeniable. One cannot help but imagine what Charles himself thought of his face. He rarely spoke of it, his court never dared mention it, but he saw the portraits, he saw the mirrors, he knew what others saw. He lived his life behind a face that marked him as both king and outcast, and yet he was powerless to change it. His deformity had been written before he was born in the chambers of ancestral palaces, in the beds of uncles and nieces, in the signatures of royal marriage contracts. The Habsburg face haunted not just Charles, but his people. Spain, once feared and respected, was now mocked. Satirical plays, underground pamphlets, and foreign courts all ridiculed the sickly monarch. They questioned his ability to rule, to breed, to even think, and they were not entirely wrong. Charles struggled with nearly every aspect of life. His condition was not cosmetic, it was systemic. His face was the frontispiece of a broken body, a crumbling mind, and a dying empire. Even after his death, the image lingered. The Habsburg jaw became a cautionary tale in medical texts, an object of curiosity in genetic studies. Scientists used it to illustrate the dangers of inbreeding. Artists used it as shorthand for decline. And yet, behind the historical analysis, there remains a human tragedy. Charles was born into a mask he could not remove. He bore it not by choice, but by blood. And for all its royal trappings, it was a face shaped not by privilege, but by a legacy of fear. The fear of dilution, the fear of loss, the fear of mixing blood with those deemed lesser. That fear birthed a dynasty, and then it buried it. Today, we remember Charles's face not because of what it looked like, but because of what it represented, the limits of power, the blindness of arrogance, and the high cost of trying to keep a bloodline pure. The Habsburgs believed they were preserving greatness. What they preserved was a curse you could see, a curse you could not ignore, a curse that stared back from every mirror. In the grand salons of the Spanish court, where portraits lined the walls and the air smelled of incense and old stone, two women passed silently through history, bound not by love, but by duty. They were queens, both of them, chosen not for their hearts, but for their wombs, and both would fail, not because they were unworthy, but because the man they married had been made to fail long before they arrived. Their names were Marie-Louise of Orléans and Maria Anna of Neuburg, the two wives of Charles II of Spain. They were the last queens of the Habsburg line, and they could not save him. Marie-Louise arrived in Spain in 1679. She was 16, a daughter of France. She had grown up in the lavish courts of Versailles, surrounded by music, mirrors, and youthful laughter. She spoke French, loved riding horses, and had once dreamed of marrying for love. But her fate was sealed by politics. Louis XIV, her uncle and sovereign, had arranged her marriage to Charles II to strengthen the fragile truce between France and Spain. She was sent south across the Pyrenees, dressed in lace and perfumed silk, with an entourage of chaperones and a letter instructing her to be obedient. Her life, from that moment on, belonged to a sickly king she had never met. When she first saw Charles, she is said to have turned pale. He greeted her awkwardly, his jaw hanging open, his speech nearly unintelligible. His enormous tongue made conversation difficult. His chin seemed to vanish into his neck. His eyes wandered. He was 21, but looked older and more broken. Still, she bowed, curtsied, and whispered, "My lord and husband." The ceremony was grand, but the silence between them afterward was louder than any hymn. Behind closed doors, they shared their wedding night. No one knows precisely what occurred, but no heir was conceived, and no heir ever would be. For the next 10 years, Marie-Louise lived in the Spanish court as a queen without power and a wife without a husband in any meaningful sense. Charles adored her. He followed her like a shadow. He lavished her with dresses and jewelry. He clung to her in moments of panic. But he could not comfort her, or engage her in real conversation, or fulfill the expectations of a king. He would spend long hours sitting beside her, silently, staring. At times he asked her to pray with him. At other times he wept in her arms. His affection was suffocating, and his emotional needs far exceeded hers. She became more nurse than wife. Marie-Louise fell into a depression that deepened each year. The Spanish court was grim, conservative, and suffocating. She had no real allies. Her French attendants were sent away under suspicion of spying. She was forbidden from writing freely to her family. Her every move was monitored. The court's suspicion of foreigners ran deep, and her failure to produce a child only made her more of a target. Whispers followed her through the palace, whispers that she was barren, cold, or secretly cursed. In truth, she was simply trapped. Charles's physical state made conception almost impossible, though no one dared say so aloud. The pressure mounted. The Inquisition loomed in the background. Religious advisors recommended fasting, penance, even exorcisms to cleanse the royal couple's misfortune. Marie-Louise endured endless masses, holy relics pressed to her stomach, and superstitious rituals meant to invoke fertility. Nothing changed. Her health began to falter. She grew thin. Her skin turned pale. Her eyes, once bright, became distant. She began to refuse food. Some said it was grief. Others suspected poison. There is no definitive answer. What is known is this. In February of 1689, at the age of 26, Queen Marie-Louise collapsed and died. The official cause was listed as acute indigestion, but few believed it. Charles was devastated. He wept uncontrollably. He ordered her room sealed and draped in black. He refused to eat for days. For all his strangeness, he had loved her perhaps more deeply than he could ever express, but he had also burdened her. His body, his mind, his court, his inheritance, none of it had been survivable. She had come to save the dynasty. Instead, she was consumed by it. Spain now faced an unbearable truth. Charles had no heir. The Habsburg line was on the brink. The council insisted he remarry. And so, within a year, a new bride was selected, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a famously fertile family. Her sister had given birth to 14 children. This detail was emphasized in the marriage negotiations, as though fertility alone might undo what centuries of inbreeding had caused. Maria Anna arrived in 1690. She was 23. Brighter, more politically savvy than her predecessor, she came with one clear mission: produce an heir. She was warned in advance of Charles's condition, but even those warnings fell short of preparing her for reality. He was worse now, older, weaker, increasingly paranoid. He had aged significantly since Marie-Louise's death. His body trembled, his speech had deteriorated further. He suffered from hallucinations, believing he was under demonic attack. He needed help to walk. Sometimes he forgot who he was speaking to. Maria Anna tried to perform her role. She attended ceremonies, appeared by his side, offered comfort, but their relationship was strained from the beginning. Charles was now obsessed with death. He surrounded himself with monks and confessors. He sought out mystics. He fasted excessively. He engaged in bizarre rituals, convinced he was cursed. Maria Anna was drawn into these superstitions. She, too, began to suspect she had been placed under a spell. The palace had become a place of whispers and fear. Like her predecessor, she failed to conceive, and once again the blame fell on the queen. Charles believed he had been bewitched, possibly by French agents, or by the ghost of his first wife, or by a dark force sent to destroy him. His advisors searched for signs of sorcery. Investigations were launched. Maria Anna was interrogated about her past. Her servants were questioned. Her correspondence was intercepted. In private, she wept. Her marriage had become a theatre of madness. Despite everything, she remained loyal, perhaps out of duty, perhaps out of fear. She stayed by Charles's side during his worst years, when his health collapsed entirely, when he could no longer walk, when he spoke in tongues, when his urine turned black, when he lay in bed for days unmoving. She sat in the shadows of a fading throne and watched an empire dissolve around a man who could barely speak his name. Toward the end, Maria Anna became politically active. She supported pro-Habsburg factions in the court, hoping to influence the line of succession. She knew Charles would die without an heir, and she feared a French takeover, but her maneuvering failed. Charles, in one of his last acts, named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, as his successor. It was a decision that ignited a European war and confirmed what many had long suspected. The Habsburg bloodline in Spain had reached its end. Charles died in 1700. He was 38. Maria Anna outlived him, but she left Spain soon after, her mission unfulfilled, her legacy forgotten. Like Marie-Louise, she had been brought in to fix what could not be fixed. They were not wives in the traditional sense. They were placeholders, human bandages placed over the wounds of a dying dynasty. History remembers them faintly, often unfairly. Their portraits hang in galleries, painted in royal gowns, faces composed, postures graceful. But beneath those layers of paint lies a truth too often overlooked. They were women swallowed by a system that valued lineage over life. They were mourned by no children, honored by no legacy, remembered mainly for what they failed to deliver. But the failure was never theirs. It belonged to the blood, the twisted, knotted bloodline of kings and queens who chose closeness over clarity, who clung to family as if it were armor, only to find it had turned to iron cold, inflexible, and deadly. Charles II had 2 queens. Neither could save him, because no woman, not even a queen, can undo what centuries of pride have already destroyed. By the end of the 17th century, Spain was a kingdom holding its breath. Its king could no longer walk, could no longer speak clearly, could no longer rule, and yet he lived. Charles II, the final Habsburg monarch of Spain, lingered like a ghost trapped between life and history. His body was disintegrating, his mind fraying at the edges, but his presence remained, and so did his crown. What no one could say aloud, what everyone feared to admit, was that Spain was no longer governed by a sovereign, it was governed by his absence. The courtiers knew it, the nobles knew it, even the common people knew it. But the throne could not remain empty, and so a strange and perilous game began, one that would not be settled by votes or debate, but by secrets whispered in candlelit chambers and letters sealed with trembling hands. It was a kingdom in waiting, waiting for the king to die, waiting to see who would take his place, waiting for Europe to decide what would become of Spain. Charles had no heir. 2 marriages had yielded no children, no successors, no hope. And because of that, the question of succession became the most dangerous issue in Europe. Spain was not just a kingdom, it was a global empire. Whoever inherited the Spanish crown would also inherit Naples, Sicily, Milan, the Spanish Netherlands, and vast colonial holdings in the Americas and beyond. To inherit Spain was to reshape the balance of power across the world. And so, all of Europe leaned in. France, ruled by Louis XIV, sought to claim the throne through his grandson Philip of Anjou, whose grandmother had been a Spanish princess. Austria, the other branch of the Habsburg family, demanded the throne for Archduke Charles, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. England and the Dutch Republic, wary of a unified Franco-Spanish superpower, braced themselves. If the wrong choice was made, the result would be war. Inside the Spanish court, this waiting became suffocating. Factions formed, alliances shifted. Some nobles supported the French claim, others backed the Austrian line. Still others tried to stall, afraid that a premature choice would provoke disaster. Every diplomat who entered Madrid came not just with gifts, but with bribes, promises, and threats. The dying king became the axis around which the great powers turned. And Charles? He drifted further into decline. He was still only in his 30s, but he looked like a man twice his age. His skin had yellowed, his muscles had wasted away, his speech had reduced to fragments, often prayers, sometimes nonsense. He was largely confined to his chambers. Rumors spread that his urine was black, that his body was failing from the inside out. Physicians prescribed all manner of treatments, leeches, purges, charms, relics. Nothing worked. He fasted, hoping divine mercy might cure him. He allowed exorcisms, hoping the devil might leave him. But the demons were not supernatural. They were political. His court became a battlefield in disguise. While Charles lay in bed, the men around him plotted the future. Maria Anna, his wife, favoured the Austrian claim. She believed the Habsburgs should rule Spain still. The pro-French faction, led by Cardinal Portocarrero, believed otherwise. They whispered to the king that Philip of Anjou would preserve Spanish independence better than another German emperor. Charles, weak and uncertain, shifted between them, pulled by whichever voice reached him last. The pressure mounted. The French sent envoys. The Austrians followed. One man arrived with gifts of exotic animals to charm the king. Another brought holy relics from the Vatican. Everyone wanted something. Everyone offered something. And through it all, Spain stood still, its armies underpaid, its people overtaxed, its colonies neglected. While Europe prepared for war, the King of Spain sat wrapped in wool blankets, unable to sign his name without assistance. Outside the palace, the streets of Madrid carried the tension. Merchants raised prices, fearing the instability ahead. Soldiers grumbled in taverns. Clergy preached warnings about judgment and decay. The people prayed for peace, but peace required clarity, and there was none. The kingdom was caught in limbo, paralyzed by the body that still sat on the throne but no longer ruled it. And then, in the autumn of 1700, something changed. Charles called for his confessor. His voice was thin, but his words were clear enough. He wished to make his final decision. He wished to name his successor. He had prayed, he said. He had fasted. He had consulted God. And now he had an answer. He named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, a Bourbon prince, as his heir. The decision sent shockwaves through Europe. To the French, it was a triumph. Louis XIV rejoiced. He would now have his grandson on the Spanish throne, a Bourbon alliance stretching from Paris to Madrid, a new superpower, blood-bound and vast. But to Austria and the rest of Europe, it was a provocation, an existential threat. If the Bourbon monarchies united, it could mean domination of trade, colonial expansion, and a shift in religious and political power across the continent. Charles signed the will with help from his aides. He wept as he did. He believed he had done the right thing. But whether that decision came from divine inspiration or courtly manipulation remains unclear. He was a dying man, a tired man, a man broken by a lifetime of inherited fragility. And now, with this signature, he had set the world on fire. 2 days later, he collapsed. His breathing slowed. His body, already half gone, began to let go. And on November 1, 1700, Charles II of Spain died. The court went into mourning. But the kingdom did not mourn. It held its breath again, because now the waiting was over, and war had begun. On November 1700, the frail, failing body of Charles II finally gave out. Spain's last Habsburg monarch died in his palace in Madrid, surrounded by priests and courtiers who had already stopped listening to his words long before his lungs stopped breathing. There was no heir, no child, no bloodline left to continue. What remained was a will signed by a shaking hand and sealed by centuries of fear, and that will had named a French Bourbon prince as King of Spain. It was not just the end of a man, it was the start of something far more dangerous. Europe did not pause to mourn. It mobilized. Within weeks of Charles's death, battle lines were drawn. Louis XIV of France moved quickly, claiming the throne of Spain on behalf of his grandson, Philip of Anjou. He styled him Philip V, King of Spain, and declared that the Bourbon family now ruled both France and Spain. Louis's court celebrated with music, feasts, and proclamations. But elsewhere, the reaction was one of fury. Austria was livid. England was alarmed. The Dutch were terrified. What many had feared, and what Charles's own court had tried desperately to prevent, was now real. A single family controlled two of the most powerful crowns in Europe. It was not just a matter of pride, it was a matter of survival. The unification of the French and Spanish empires, under Bourbon rule, threatened to dominate the European balance of power. Combined, their fleets could outmatch England, their land armies could crush Austria, their colonial holdings could strangle Dutch trade. To allow the Bourbons to rule both kingdoms was, for many, to allow France to rule the world. And so, war became inevitable. They called it the War of the Spanish Succession, but it was more than that. It was a war to contain a bloodline that had already overreached. A war not just for crowns or borders, but for the very structure of Europe. And it had all begun with the death of a king who had barely ruled and whose greatest act was simply dying. The alliances came swiftly. Austria, under the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, put forward his son, Archduke Charles, as the rightful heir to Spain. England joined them, fearing French dominance of the seas. The Dutch Republic, ever vulnerable to French aggression, followed. Soon the Grand Alliance was formed, a coalition designed to challenge Philip V's claim and prevent a Bourbon Empire from stretching across Europe and the Americas. The war would last over a decade. It would engulf cities and countryside, from the fields of Flanders to the ports of Naples. It would turn brothers against brothers, subjects against monarchs, and colonists against empires, and all of it could be traced back to the body of Charles II, a monarch so disfigured by inbreeding that his very existence had become a diplomatic crisis. Spain itself was split. Some supported Philip V, believing the Bourbon claim would bring strength and renewal. Others supported Archduke Charles, the Austrian candidate, hoping to keep the Habsburg legacy alive. In cities like Barcelona and Valencia, uprisings broke out. Local nobles pledged loyalty to opposing claimants. The empire fractured along lines of loyalty and exhaustion. After decades of decline, famine, and military failure, Spain no longer had the strength to decide its own fate. Meanwhile, in France, Louis XIV pushed forward. He installed Philip on the Spanish throne, ignoring protests from abroad. He marched troops into Spanish territories. He positioned France as the guardian of Spain's future. But in doing so, he triggered the very catastrophe he had hoped to avoid. English and Dutch ships blockaded his ports. Austrian forces invaded Italy. Battles erupted across the continent, each one bloodier than the last. At Blenheim, in 1704, Allied forces under the Duke of Marlborough crushed the Franco-Bavarian army. At Ramillies, in 1706, the French were routed again. The war turned against Louis. His economy faltered, his people starved, and still, the fighting continued. Because now, it was not just about Spain. It was about vengeance, power, and the centuries of fear that had come to a head in a single royal death. And always, in the background, there was Charles. Not his body buried beneath marble and candlelight in the El Escorial, but his legacy, his failure to produce an heir, his failure to rule, his failure to survive the curse of his lineage. Every cannon fired, every soldier killed, every city sacked. These were echoes of a dynasty that had fed on itself for too long. The war was not just a political reckoning, it was a genetic one. The world had watched the Habsburgs collapse in slow motion. They had seen Charles II stumble through ceremonies, drooling and confused. They had witnessed two queens weep at his bedside, unable to bear children. They had read the doctor's reports, seen the twisted jawlines, the hollow eyes, the listless hands. The war was the exclamation point at the end of that sentence. It would not be settled quickly. Philip V held Madrid, but Archduke Charles controlled much of eastern Spain. Battles like Almansa and Brihuega turned the tide back and forth. Peasant uprisings and regional revolts added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, in the colonies, the war spread. Spanish America was divided in loyalty. British and French forces clashed in the Caribbean. The Atlantic seethed with privateers, pirates, and warships. Europe bled, all because a boy had been born with too much royal blood and no chin to hold up a crown. By 1711, something unexpected happened. Emperor Joseph I of Austria died suddenly, and Archduke Charles became Holy Roman Emperor. Suddenly, the Allied plan to place him on the Spanish throne looked dangerous. Now he would control both Austria and Spain. The very outcome they had gone to war to prevent with France now threatened to emerge in another form. The balance shifted again. England pulled out of the war, the Dutch followed, the Grand Alliance fractured, and in 1713 the Treaty of Utrecht was signed. Philip V remained King of Spain, but on one condition. He had to renounce all claims to the French throne. The Spanish and French crowns would never again be united. It was a compromise once soaked in blood, but acceptable enough to end the nightmare. Spain lost territories, Naples, Milan, the Spanish Netherlands, but kept its empire intact. France retained Philip as a Bourbon king in Spain, but its dreams of continental domination were shattered. Austria gained land, Britain expanded its trade routes, and Europe exhaled quietly, wearily, and without joy. The war had claimed over 1 million lives, and it had begun in a bedroom in Madrid, with a monarch who could not chew, could not walk, could not rule, but whose death proved more explosive than his life. History does not always remember the quiet collapses, but Charles II was the beginning of one of the loudest. He did not speak clearly in life, but in death he screamed across a continent. The dynasty died long before Charles did. His heart may have stopped on a quiet November evening in 1700, but the real death, the one that mattered, was drawn out over centuries, hidden behind velvet curtains, gilded portraits, and increasingly twisted marriages. His passing merely gave the final breath to something already decaying, and what followed, in both the literal and symbolic sense, was an autopsy not just of a man, but of a ruling house that had slowly turned its own blood into poison. They opened his body shortly after death. It was customary for a king. The physicians who performed the autopsy were not searching for mysteries, they were confirming suspicions. By then, everyone in the royal household knew Charles had been unwell. His appearance alone betrayed something unnatural, but even seasoned doctors were horrified by what they found. The details, though often filtered through the lens of political discretion, would leak into public memory, grim, strange, unforgettable. His body was emaciated. His limbs, especially the legs, were thin and atrophied. His heart was described as the size of a walnut, shrunken, underdeveloped, barely worthy of a man, let alone a king. His lungs were discolored. His intestines were blackened and full of putrid matter. His kidneys were shriveled. His head, according to accounts, was abnormally large for the size of his body, suggesting possible hydrocephalus. His testicles were small, soft, and misshapen, evidence that he may have suffered from hormonal or developmental abnormalities. The stomach was said to contain a greenish liquid and little else. The autopsy did not produce a single diagnosis. It couldn't. Medicine at the time lacked the language to describe what Charles truly suffered from. But what they observed was the wreckage of a body that had never functioned properly, not in childhood, not in adulthood, and certainly not in death. It was a system slowly breaking down under its own flawed instructions. What they had opened was not just a corpse. It was the physical record of centuries of royal inbreeding, of a family that had fused power with purity and refused to see the cost. Modern geneticists have done what those 18th century doctors could not. By reconstructing the Habsburg genealogy and analyzing patterns of disease, mutation, and deformity, they've come to a grim conclusion. Charles II had one of the highest known inbreeding coefficients of any royal in history. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were both double first cousins. His ancestry folded back on itself, generation after generation, until what remained was less a family tree and more a closed loop, a biological cul-de-sac. This wasn't accidental, it was strategic. The Habsburgs believed that divine right extended through blood, and that to mix royal blood with the blood of lesser families was to dilute God's will. So they married cousins. Then they married uncles and nieces, and in at least one case, they nearly arranged a sibling union. Each generation closed the genetic circle a little tighter, and with every tightening came a price. The Habsburg jaw, once a mild protrusion, became monstrous. Fertility rates plummeted. Child mortality soared. Mental instability crept into the lineage. By the time of Charles II, that price had reached its peak. He was not an anomaly. He was the sum total, the final draft of a manuscript written in genetic error. The autopsy did not name the dynasty's cause of death, but we can. It was pride. It was isolation. It was the myth of purity taken to its natural conclusion. And yet, when Charles died, they still buried him like a king. He was placed in the Pantheon of Kings at the El Escorial, a monumental monastery palace northwest of Madrid. He was dressed in royal vestments. A crown rested near his broken skull. Masses were said. Bells were tolled. Foreign dignitaries sent their condolences. But none of it masked the reality that his burial marked the end of a chapter Europe could no longer deny. The Habsburgs of Spain were gone, and in their place, war, division, collapse. Charles left behind a country that no longer knew itself. The empire that once spanned the oceans had withered. The Spanish Netherlands were slipping away. Italy was fracturing. The colonies were restless. And the throne, empty, fragile, disputed, had become a prize no one could claim without bloodshed. The autopsy of the dynasty continued in the courtrooms of Europe. Lawyers, ambassadors, and monarchs dissected the Habsburg legacy like surgeons claiming this territory, cutting away that privilege, arguing over succession treaties and marriage contracts like they were organs to be redistributed. The empire Charles left behind was not inherited. It was partitioned, dismantled, and in many ways deservedly so. But the story did not end with his death, because what Charles II represents, what his life and body symbolize, goes beyond any single war or treaty. He is a warning, not just about inbreeding, but about power unchecked by reason, about tradition carried beyond the point of purpose, about families who believe they are chosen and therefore immune to consequence. The autopsy of Charles II is not only a historical report, it is a mirror, a reminder of what happens when empires believe themselves eternal, when blood becomes doctrine, when titles become more sacred than truth. The Habsburgs ruled by blood, but blood in the end turned against them. They buried Charles with a crown, but beneath it was a skull that could not close a mouth, a brain that could not follow thought, a jaw that had consumed generations of pride. This was not a tragedy of medicine, it was a tragedy of belief. And long after the body was buried, long after the doctors washed their hands, long after the last war of succession ended, that belief, the myth of royal blood, would continue to echo. Because history doesn't always learn from its autopsies. Sometimes it embalms the corpse and builds another throne atop it. In the final years of his life, Charles II no longer behaved like a monarch. He acted like a man already buried. The grand palaces of Madrid, once echoing with ritual and ceremony, became shadows of themselves, silent, heavy, and watchful. And within them wandered a king who no longer believed he was alive. He had become convinced of a terrible truth, that he was cursed. Not merely ill, not just unlucky, but damned, in the deepest, most eternal sense of the word. He believed that his body had been taken over by dark forces, that his blood was not his own, that demons stalked the corridors of his palace and hid behind the faces of his closest advisors. To the outside world, these were the ravings of a sick mind. But to Charles, they were undeniable. He began seeing figures in mirrors, not reflections, shadows, flickers of movement, eyes that blinked when his did not. He ordered all but one of the mirrors in his chambers covered. The remaining one was framed in iron and blessed by a priest. Still, he claimed it whispered to him at night. He stopped trusting his own servants. He believed they were agents of the devil. Some nights he refused to eat, fearing his food had been cursed. On others he demanded that it be tested by priests or animals before he touched it. He grew thinner, his cheeks hollowed, his robes hung from him like funeral cloth. The Catholic faith, long a pillar of the Habsburg throne, now became something darker in Charles's hands, a tool of desperation. He surrounded himself with confessors and monks, exorcists and mystics. He held endless masses in his chambers. He slept with relics sewn into his bedclothes. He whispered Latin prayers through cracked lips, even as his tongue stumbled on the words. But prayers weren't enough. He needed answers from the dead, and so he turned to necromancy. In one of the most bizarre episodes in royal history, Charles II authorized the exhumation of dead monarchs from the royal crypt beneath El Escorial. He wanted their corpses brought up, examined, and if possible communed with. These were not empty rituals. Charles believed that the spirits of his ancestors held the key to his salvation. He wanted to know why he was the way he was, why no child would come, why he could not rule, why his body felt like it belonged to someone else. In one case, he demanded that the remains of his great-grandfather, Philip II, be laid before him. According to court rumor, he stared at the skeleton in silence for hours. No one knows what he expected, revelation perhaps, forgiveness, or simply a confirmation that death was not the worst fate awaiting him. His court was horrified, but no one stopped him. He was still king. They brought in men claiming to speak with spirits. One was said to have a book bound in human skin. Another made Charles drink strange elixirs said to cleanse the soul. He began to suffer hallucinations. He claimed that insects were crawling beneath his skin. He begged to be exorcised. And so he was, several times. In one account, an exorcist stood over the king's bed as Charles wept and screamed, shouting that he was being held down by invisible hands. Holy water was splashed. Prayers shouted. When it ended, Charles whispered, "It is still inside me." His paranoia deepened. He suspected witches had cursed him. He accused members of his own court, some loyal for decades, of conspiring against him through black magic. The Inquisition, though weakened, was still active, and several women were interrogated and imprisoned at Charles's request. One was tortured into confessing that she had placed a spell upon the king's marriage bed, rendering him impotent. Her confession did nothing to ease him. He now refused to sleep alone. He kept candles burning through the night. He spoke to empty corners of the room. At times, he insisted that his first wife, Marie-Louise, dead for years, was still watching him. He claimed to smell her perfume, to hear her voice from the shadows. He began to write letters to the Pope, begging for answers. His handwriting shook violently. Entire sentences were illegible. Sometimes he would stop mid-signature, convinced that even his name had been cursed. Royal edicts required multiple rewrites because his signature trembled so badly that his ministers feared the people would think he was possessed. And all the while, his body continued to decay. His teeth fell out, his eyes grew clouded, his skin turned sallow, sometimes tinged with green. He lost control of his bowels, his legs swelled and cracked. Some days, he could not rise from bed. Other days, he tried to walk and collapsed after only a few steps. But it was not the physical pain that broke him, it was the certainty that this suffering was not natural. He believed he had been marked at birth, that his lineage, once divine, had become damned, that he was paying the price for sins committed generations before he was born. And in that belief, he was not entirely wrong, because while Charles saw devils and witches, the real demon was something much older, much colder, and much more rational, his own bloodline. He had become the final vessel for the Habsburg experiment, a body that had reached the end of what it could endure, and somewhere in his fading mind, Charles understood that. He had inherited a throne that had no future, a crown too heavy to wear, a name that brought more suffering than honor, and so he descended into mysticism because reason had never given him a way out. By the year 1700, the court around him resembled a monastery more than a palace, advisors whispered. Servants wore expressions of pity and dread. Foreign diplomats avoided direct contact, and Charles, thin, wild-eyed, reeking of incense and fear, waited, not for healing, but for the end. He no longer asked to be saved, he only asked to be understood. By the time Charles II took his final breath, Few in Spain understood the full weight of what had happened not just to their king, but to their dynasty, their empire, and their blood. The horror of Charles's condition had been whispered about in palaces, gossiped in foreign courts, and eventually dissected in an autopsy room. But it would take centuries and the tools of modern science to fully grasp what had been done. Charles wasn't simply an unfortunate monarch with poor health. He was a human equation, a statistical inevitability, the last living answer to a question that had been repeated again and again in royal marriages. What happens when power refuses to marry outside itself? The answer was Charles. In the field of genetics, there's a term, the coefficient of inbreeding. It measures the probability that a child will inherit two identical copies of a gene, one from each parent due to shared ancestry. In the general population, this number is low. Families are large, gene pools are wide. But in royal families, especially dynasties obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure, the number rises, slowly, steadily, dangerously. Charles II's coefficient of inbreeding has been calculated at 0.254, an astonishing figure. To put that into perspective, a child born from a brother-sister union would have a coefficient of 0.25. Charles was, genetically speaking, more inbred than the child of incest, and yet his parents were not siblings. His father, Philip IV of Spain, had married his own niece Mariana of Austria, which means Charles was the product not just of one generation of inbreeding, but of many. For over 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs had married within a limited gene pool, often recycling the same few families, cousins, double cousins, uncles, and nieces, until the same genetic material circled back on itself. What Charles inherited was not just royal blood, but a condensed and corrupted version of it. This is not speculation, it is science. In 2009, a team of Spanish scientists published a landmark study that examined the genealogy of the Spanish Habsburgs using 16 generations of data. They cross-referenced medical reports, portraits, historical records, and modern genetic modeling. The conclusion was inescapable. Charles II's physical and mental decline was not simply due to bad luck. It was the mathematically predictable result of intense inbreeding. What began as mild traits in earlier generations, protruding jaws, fertility issues, recurring illnesses, intensified with each consanguineous marriage. With fewer new genes entering the pool, harmful recessive alleles began to pair up. Normally, such genes are harmless when inherited from just one parent. But when both parents carry the same rare mutation, the child has no escape. Genetic disorders surface, developmental issues follow, fertility collapses, immunity weakens, organs fail. In Charles's case, all of these came true. He had severe mandibular prognathism, the infamous Habsburg jaw which made chewing and speaking difficult. He likely suffered from hydrocephalus, a build-up of fluid in the brain that can cause mental delays. His endocrine system was probably impaired. Reports suggest underdeveloped sexual organs, infertility, and stunted growth. His immune system was so weak that even minor illnesses became life-threatening. He suffered seizures, chronic fatigue, digestive disorders, and possibly pituitary dysfunction, and those were just the visible symptoms. There may have been dozens of unseen problems, neurological, hormonal, autoimmune, that no doctor in the 1600s could have named. But today, with the benefit of genetic science, we can trace them all back to a single cause: too much shared DNA. And Charles was not alone. His siblings, if they survived at all, died young. His father, Philip IV, had 15 children with 2 wives, but most of them died in childhood. The few who lived were often sickly. One of Charles's brothers died at age 3. Another was described as having unusual eyes and slow speech. His cousin Leopold I, who ruled Austria, showed signs of the same jaw deformity. Across the family, the pattern was unmistakable. It had all been in service of a myth, the myth of purity. For the Habsburgs, royal blood was sacred. To mix with commoners, even noble ones, was unthinkable. Marriage was a political act, and alliances were safest when made with family. But what they failed to see, or chose to ignore, was that every marriage within that closed circle was a gamble, a coin toss with higher and higher stakes. And Charles II was the moment when the coin finally landed edge down, impossibly broken. Historians often treat Charles's reign as a tragic story, a weak king who stumbled through a crumbling empire. But viewed through the lens of biology, it becomes something more profound, a case study in generational error, a warning not of political hubris, but of biological collapse. He was not cursed, he was calculated, and the tragedy is that no one stopped it. They had centuries to course correct. There were opportunities to bring in new blood daughters who could have married into foreign families, sons who might have taken brides outside the incestuous loop. But fear ruled every decision. Fear of foreign influence, fear of rival claims, fear of losing control, and so they chose what felt safe, family, again and again. But safety, in this case, was poison, and Charles, perhaps more than anyone, felt it. He was not unaware of his condition. He may not have understood the genetics, but he understood pain. He understood isolation. He understood failure, not just in the eyes of his court, but in the eyes of God, or so he believed. He spent his final years convinced he was the victim of witchcraft or demons. In truth, the real demon had many names: political paranoia, dynastic obsession, scientific ignorance. And love had little to do with it. Charles's parents did not marry for affection, nor their parents. These were marriages of policy, of alliance, of calculation. The children they produced were not just heirs, they were strategies. And Charles was the final strategy, one that had run out of options. In a way, he was a marvel, a man whose body bore the visible, measurable consequences of 200 years of royal genetics turned inward. He is studied not just in history books, but in medical schools and genetics courses. He is referenced in academic journals as a warning case. His skeleton, if ever studied in full, would likely tell the same story his reign did: compression, collapse, and failure coded into every cell. But what Charles's story also proves is that genetics is not abstract. It is deeply human. Every decision made generations before him to keep the bloodline intact, to avoid outside marriages, to repeat the same unions over and over, those choices shaped not just who he became, but what he endured. His story is not myth, it is math, and like all equations left unchecked, it eventually produced a result no one could ignore. History rarely allows for rewrites, but with Charles II, the question lingers softly, persistently, like a breath in a closed room. Could it have been prevented? Could there have been another way? Could Spain, so vast, so powerful, so rich, have avoided the quiet catastrophe that was Charles's reign? Could the child born with no chin, no heir, and no strength have instead been something else, someone else? To answer that, we must look not just at Charles, but at the world that made him. The Spanish Habsburgs ruled over a global empire. Their lands stretched from the Netherlands to the Americas, from the coast of Naples to the heart of Castile. They governed with the authority of kings and the sanctity of Catholicism. They saw themselves not merely as monarchs, but as ordained instruments of divine will. In their eyes, their blood was not just royal, it was sacred, and sacred blood was not to be mixed lightly. So they married within the family, not once, not twice, but again and again and again, until a web of consanguinity wrapped itself around the throne. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins. Political strategy masqueraded as tradition, and generation by generation the gene pool narrowed. The world outside the palace grew larger and more complex, but inside, the marriage alliances became increasingly desperate. It wasn't ignorance, it was intention. They believed that to marry outsiders, non-Habsburgs, non-royals, non-Catholics, was to weaken the dynasty. To allow foreign blood into the family was to surrender something divine. That belief was so strong, so embedded, that even as children died in infancy, even as jaws deformed, even as minds slowed and bodies failed, they persisted. Because to stop would mean to admit that the throne was not eternal. But what if they had stopped? What if, Somewhere along the line, a Habsburg king had broken the loop. What if a monarch, perhaps Philip II, perhaps even Charles's own father, had chosen a spouse not for her bloodline, but for her health, her vigor, her distance from his family tree? It would not have been impossible. European royal courts were teeming with eligible women. Noble families from England, France, Portugal, the German states, even the rising powers of Scandinavia could have provided fresh genetic stock. Marriages could still have been political, but with a new strategy: survival, not purity. Would Charles II have been born then? Possibly not. Or at least, not in the form history remembers him. He might have been a different child entirely, one with a functioning jaw, a clearer mind, a stronger body. He might have grown into a king who could ride horses, command armies, write letters with a steady hand. He might have fathered heirs, stabilized the throne, delayed the collapse. But such a future was never considered, because the idea of purity was too powerful. The Spanish Habsburgs lived in a paradox. They ruled over the most expansive and diverse empire on earth, yet they kept their own lineage as narrow as possible. They conquered foreign lands, but refused foreign marriages. They claimed divine protection while ignoring the natural consequences of their choices. And perhaps most tragically, they mistook tradition for destiny. This wasn't merely hubris, it was fear. Fear of dilution, fear of political betrayal, fear that the identity of the crown would vanish if it wasn't replicated in each child. The Habsburgs weren't just trying to protect their blood, they were trying to preserve an image, a brand, a lineage so holy it could not be touched. And in doing so, they passed the same fragile copy down through the generations until it could no longer support itself. And when Charles arrived, frail and malformed, it was already too late. He was not the beginning of decline, he was the end point, the inevitable result of too many closed doors. He could barely speak, barely eat, barely think, and yet they crowned him. They dressed him in gold, set him on thrones, paraded him before the people, because to do otherwise would be to admit the great lie, that the system had failed. Could it have been prevented? Yes, but not through medicine, not through prayer, only through change. A willingness to let go of the illusion that divine right protected blood from biology. A willingness to marry outside tradition. A willingness to reimagine the monarchy not as a sealed chamber, but as something that could adapt. But adaptation is difficult when your entire identity is built on constancy. The Habsburgs were not just rulers, they were relics, living symbols of a past that believed itself immortal. They never questioned the pattern, and so the pattern consumed them. Charles II was not the victim of one bad match. He was the result of a system that refused to evolve. His story is often framed as tragedy, and it is, but it is also instruction, a lesson in what happens when legacy is valued more than life, when titles matter more than the children who carry them, when a throne is treated as eternal, even as the blood beneath it rots. Could it have been prevented? Yes, but not by Charles. He inherited the throne, the body, the failure. The choice had been made long before he was born, and by the time he understood it, he was already breaking under the weight of a name too old to remember how to change. The cradle is empty now. No child stirs beneath the velvet canopy once sewn for princes. The painted ceilings of the Spanish court still gaze down, unchanged, but the line that once filled these halls with names and titles, robes and rituals, has ended. Charles II, the last of his kind, is long buried, but the silence he left behind has never truly lifted. It lingers in the palaces, in the corridors once filled with the sound of clinking spurs and whispered prayers, in the heavy mirrors, some still covered in cloth, that no one dares remove. Spain moved on, history moved on, but the memory of what ended with Charles is not so easily swept away. His story was not one of war or glory or rebellion. It was something more intimate, more haunting, the slow, suffocating collapse of a body, his body, and through it, the slow collapse of an empire's illusion. He had no child, no successor, but he was never meant to be a father. He was meant to be a bridge, a biological thread between past and future. And when his body failed, when his blood collapsed into itself, That bridge gave way. Behind him, 200 years of strategy, calculation, and ceremony. Ahead of him, fire, war, and the rearrangement of Europe. Charles's reign was not marked by decisive battles or great reforms. It was marked by silence, by hesitation, by waiting. And that silence said everything. It spoke of a dynasty so paralyzed by its own traditions that it chose extinction over adaptation. A house that ruled half the world, yet never learned how to look beyond its own reflection. In the end, it wasn't poison that killed the Spanish Habsburgs. It wasn't revolution or assassination. It wasn't even war. It was policy, marriage policy, lineage policy. The quiet decisions made in royal chambers, generation after generation, until there were no decisions left to make. Just one final child, just Charles. He never stood a chance. The signs were there from the beginning. A jaw that would not close, a tongue too large for his mouth, a mind that flickered like a candle in wind. They called him the Bewitched, and maybe that's what it felt like to those who served him, a man imprisoned not by his enemies, but by his own skin. He was tended like an heirloom, watched like a relic, and slowly he became both. And yet Charles endured. Through pain, through humiliation, through isolation he endured. Not with power, but with presence. He lingered. He held the throne longer than anyone expected. He signed where he could. He prayed when nothing else worked. He saw ghosts. He questioned everything. He watched as the world gathered at his bedside, not in loyalty, but in anticipation, because his death meant more than his life. When he died, the doctors opened him and found what everyone had feared, a body so compromised it was already rotting, a heart too small, organs failing, bones brittle, the physical proof of a dynasty's unraveling, a human monument to what happens when belief is placed in blood instead of wisdom. They buried him in silence. The vault closed, the marble sealed, the crown passed to someone else, someone from another house, another nation. And so the line ended, not with rebellion, not with violence, with breath, faint, shallow, final. Now, centuries later, his story is retold not in triumph, but in warning. The name Charles II of Spain is spoken quietly in textbooks, often with a picture that looks more caricature than king, the jaw, the pale eyes, the long face. But to reduce him to his appearance is to miss the point. Charles was not a monster. He was made by policy, by fear, by tradition that refused to question itself. He was born not of love or chance, but of paperwork and protocol. His existence was planned by committees and councils, not by couples. And when that plan failed, it failed entirely. Today, we speak often of legacy, of ancestry, of keeping things in the family. But Charles is a reminder that some legacies, left unchecked, become burdens, that some bloodlines grow too heavy for the bodies that must carry them, and that sometimes, in trying too hard to preserve power, we destroy the very thing we meant to protect. So let us leave the cradle empty. Let us not wish for another heir to that line. Let the silence stand. Let the lessons echo quietly through the empty rooms of El Escorial and the pages of forgotten letters, because in the end, Charles did not fail. The system that made him did. And perhaps, in that stillness, in that quiet failure, there is something honest, something final, something that tells us not just about kings and crowns, but about the cost of believing too much in blood. And now, may the ghosts of empires past lull you gently into sleep.